I'd like to welcome you today to our Beef and Forage Focus webinars. These are webinars that are held on the first and third Tuesdays of the month. Today I'm pleased to have Dr. Galen Erickson with us, who's a beef feedlot specialist with the University of Nebraska, talking about alkali treatment of residue for growing and finishing cattle.
Thanks, Aaron. It was about a year ago we presented some research on this topic, and really there's been some new things since then, and so we thought it was timely to revisit this issue. And so I'll focus some on things that we've been presenting on treating corn stalks primarily with calcium oxide and feeding it to finishing cattle. But we'll have some new things in that regard, and then also some focus here at the end anyway on growing cattle and how this may fit there. Certainly want to start with, this really got started with our research program here at UNL with some funding from ADM quite a number of years ago to support, first off, looking at calcium oxide treatment of forages and feeding it in finishing diets at elevated levels, somewhat with the goal of replacing expensive corn. And I think that's important, and we'll come back to that here later on. Clearly, this concept's not new. In fact, many of the current research things that we're exploring here at the University of Nebraska are somewhat revisiting things that were tried 40 years ago. And I put this on here to remind everybody that really we have learned a lot from treating residues from work that was started back in the 60s and 70s, and that's because, frankly, feed prices were high then, maybe in real dollars higher than they are today, which may sound puzzling, but two primary things have been tried that are referred to as alkaline treatment. And what I mean by alkaline treatment is all we're trying to do is apply a strong base to a forage to improve the fiber digestibility. And it does that by solubilizing some of the hemicellulose and then making the hemicellulose and the cellulose that remains more digestible. Many people incorrectly state that, well, this gets rid of some of the lignin in the forage, and that's not quite true. All this does is make some of the cellulose and hemicellulose that's bound in forages to lignin more available to the microbes in the rumen. So it does improve fiber digestibility, and it does increase the solubility or release of some hemicellulose, but it really doesn't change the lignin content. It takes some stronger chemicals to do that. The strongest one that's been used historically was sodium hydroxide, and that's a bad chemical to be handling. And so there was some work early on with calcium hydroxide, which is this calcium OH2, and then some of the work today that I'm going to talk about is using calcium oxide, but I don't want people to get too confused because calcium oxide in the presence of water becomes calcium hydroxide. So it's the hydroxide that's doing the work. In general, sodium hydroxide is stronger, and so you get a greater improvement in digestibility, but actually having some calcium hydroxide or calcium oxide in combination with it is a plus too. Okay, so all the work I'm going to talk about has been treating forages with calcium oxide. Sometimes that's called quicklime. There's a lot of different lime products that people can try. I just want to point out that I think it's important that it be pure and reactive quicklime, and also the particle size is important. So why did we choose calcium oxide, or why would people be interested in calcium hydroxide over sodium hydroxide? Well, frankly, it's less caustic, meaning it's not as difficult to handle. It's cost competitive. It still has the improvement in digestibility that we're after, albeit maybe not as large. There's really no detrimental impact of the calcium once it's been used on the forage in terms of environmental issues, whereas there could be for sodium. And we need calcium anyway, especially in finishing diets. The cattle need to have supplemental calcium, and so this is one way to provide that. But to be fair, the most common other source of calcium would be limestone, which is even cheaper. So I'm not sure it's an inexpensive source of calcium, but at least it's providing a nutrient we have to add anyway. Now, all of our research has been focused on calcium oxide that again becomes calcium hydroxide. Calcium hydroxide should work similar to calcium oxide, but I do want to point out that if you're going to use calcium hydroxide, you do have to add more. All of our work's been adding 5% calcium oxide to the forage on a dry matter basis. If you use calcium hydroxide, because it has a different chemical structure, you need to add 6.67% calcium hydroxide. So how does this work? Well, it's actually fairly straightforward, but it's also a challenging step for many. We basically take our residue, or forage in this case, and we add our 5% calcium oxide on a dry matter basis to that forage, add enough water to get it to 50% is the way our studies have been done. So it's 50% water, 50% dry matter at the end, and then it's stored for at least 7 days in the studies that I'm going to show. If you use stronger chemicals, you might be able to store it for less time, but we don't have any real evidence that going longer than 7 days is a plus, even though that's been speculated. So what about this forage? Again, the hardest part for many producers is this physical process of getting the residue treated. And primarily because you have to grind the residue first. I'm going to talk about this more, but most of our work's been with a 3-inch grind on stalks or straw. Some of our work has actually been as low as a 1-inch grind. Now, producers, when we first started talking about 3-inch grinds, said, well, that's not how we do it. We use a 5 or a 7-inch screen. Well, our data suggests that 3 inches is ideal, and at 1 inch is good, and 1 inch is even better. So grind size is important here. You then add the water and the calcium oxide, mix, and then store it. Now, as you see from the picture, that's an anaerobic storage in a bag, but that's not required for the treatment process to work. This can be stored just in a pile. We just chose to store it in a bag, many times because we were storing it longer than 7 to 14 days. And if you are going to store longer than 7 to 14 days, then anaerobic storage is probably critical. Okay, so I'm going to go through some trials as examples of work we've done and highlight the responses, and then kind of summarize this at the end for finishing cattle. So to start with, we're talking about finishing cattle. So all of these first studies are all in finishing cattle. This one here was reported in our 2013 Nebraska beef report. The control diet has 51% corn and 5% stalks, which would be very typical of many finishing diets, has 40% wet distillers grains included in the diet. And then we're comparing that to 2 diets here that are labeled treated or non-treated. Both of those diets have 20% corn stalks and therefore 15% less corn. The treated have been treated with the 5% calcium oxide and gotten to 50% dry matter. The non-treated was just ground and fed at 20% of the diet. So if you look at gain and feed conversion, so pounds of feed per pound of gain, clearly if you just replace 15% corn with 15% more corn stalks, you decrease gain relative to this control diet, and you have you hurt or increase feed conversion. But notice that in this study, these were with calf feds, well replicated. We got identical gain and identical feed conversion by feeding the 20% treated stalks relative to 5% untreated stalks and 15% more corn. Carcass weights were what you would expect. Again, not different between the control and the treated. Lower for the cattle just fed extra stalks. Fat depth sort of mimics what we saw for gain. Decent marbling scores, at least on the 2 treatments that finished or had good performance in terms of gain and conversions, and certainly no impact on percent choice. Now this is a second study, same exact design, but with yearlings. So again, 3 treatments of control, treated and non-treated. In this case, numerically, the cattle fed treated stocks had a little bit lower gain, had a little bit higher, had significantly more intake. And so in this one study, actually feed conversion was not identical between the 20% treated stocks. It was actually greater feed conversion or poorer. But notice if it was untreated, it was even worse. And so we're getting a response to treating the residue, but in this case, we weren't able to get identical performance between the control with 5% stocks and the 20% treated stock treatment. Hot carcass weight, again, reflects performance, fat depth, and quality grades all reflect how the cattle gained and how the conversions were. Okay, so we've done, I think it's 7 experiments now looking at finishing cattle, and that one yearling study I just presented is one of them where we did not get identical performance. This study was a little bit different in that we had a 3-inch grind and a 1-inch grind for the stalks, and then we had a similar control diet. So notice the control diet has 5% stalks, 40% modified distillers grains. The 1-inch grind has 20% treated or not treated stalks. Again, all diets have 40% distillers. And then the 3-inch grind is the same as the 1-inch, but obviously the grind size is different in those diets. So looking at performance, notice that just looking at the treated 1-inch and the treated 3-inch, we got statistically similar gain and, if anything, better or similar feed conversion. So notice that the 1-inch grind does improve feed conversion over 3-inch grind, but it did it in both the untreated and the untreated diets. And so 1-inch grind is better than 3-inch grind, but that's not the main point of this trial either. The main point of this trial is that we got similar conversions or even better conversions if we had a lower grind. Now, bear in mind that the control has 5% stalks again, and those are at a 3-inch grind. Carcass data, same idea, that reflects the gains that you saw, where the hot carcass weights were similar for the 2 treated diets compared to the control. They drop off when you have it fed at 20% of the diet and untreated. Dressing percent, I wanted to point out here, is impacted many times by how much rough feed you feed, and I'm going to come back to that in another study where it's even more evident with different levels. Marbling scores, again, likely reflect how the cattle performed in terms of gain, and then obviously the percent choice and above as well. So we have numerous studies in our system where we had identical performance, and then we have one where we did not get identical performance, comparing the 20% treated stocks to a 5% stocks control finishing diet. This is a commercial study. It was done at a commercial feedlot in northeast Colorado by Cattlemen's Nutrition Services and Performance Plus. So notice large numbers of steers, and they were fed in the summer as summer yearlings. And in this case, there was just 2 diets. The control diet had 6% stocks. The treated diet has 20% treated stocks. So there's 14% less corn in the treated diet as compared to control. And I presented things on a live average daily gain, live feed conversion, and then average daily gain on a carcass adjusted basis and feed conversion on a carcass adjusted basis, which I believe the most important line here is the last one, feed conversion on a carcass adjusted basis, because again, dressing percent can be influenced when we talk about feeding more roughage. So looking at feed conversion on a carcass adjusted basis and average daily gain on a carcass adjusted basis, the cattle fed 20% treated stocks had significantly lower gains, albeit not large but significant, and 0.3 units greater feed conversion or poorer feed conversion. This study will be published in our 2014 Nebraska Beef Report that's not out till the fall. Now, the last study I want to discuss relative to finishing cattle is a very new one, again, just completed this spring, that will be published in our 2014 Nebraska Beef Report. And the reason we did this study is that all of the previous studies have a fairly large amount of distillers grains, 35 to 40%. And we hypothesized that having that much distillers in the diet was pretty important to how well this treated residue performed. And one of our concerns is that many producers had been feeding 35 to 40% distillers grains in their feedlot diets, but had to back off on the amount of distillers that they were feeding this last year because of economics and price relationship to corn, which is fine. But if they were treating residue, they may have just made this change and not worried about whether their performance would change. And I want to point out that that's one of the reasons why we studied this. So we have 7 diets. The control diet has 20% distillers, 5% stalks, untreated. All of these other diets have 10, 20, or 30% treated stalks, and those stalks are either in a 20% distillers diet or a 40% distillers diet. Now, if you look at this, there's a linear decrease in gain as we increase treated residue when there's 20% distillers, but notice it's quadratic when we look at it within 40, where actually our gains look very good feeding 10 or 20% treated residue as long as we've got 40% distillers in a diet. When you get up to 30% treated stocks, gains dropped off dramatically. Same idea happened with conversion. With 20% distillers in the diet, conversions increased or got poorer linearly as we went from 10 to 30%. Conversions when we had 40% distillers in the diet was quadratic. Notice it's very good conversions when we have 10 or 20% treated residue, and increases dramatically when we get to 30, and that's why it's a quadratic response. What about carcass performance? Same idea, but here I wanted to illustrate the dressing percent issue and why looking at things on a carcass weight basis is the most critical way to evaluate these data. Because when we feed higher levels of residue, treated in this case with 20% distillers, we see a quadratic drop-off in dressing percent, and we see a linear decrease in dressing percent at 40% modified distillers. I don't know that response curve is what's critical. My point is that if you weighed these cattle live, the live weights would not be very depressed. But when you go to slaughter those cattle, the carcass weights are dramatically lower, especially at those very high levels of treated residue. So it's critical to look at things on a carcass weight basis, because frankly, that's how we're selling cattle. And frankly, if you're selling cattle live, you're being evaluated on carcass weights. Fat depths decreased as you'd expect from the performance. Okay, so in feedlot diets, it may be economical at times to use treated stocks, especially if grain's expensive and residue's cheap. And so if we look at stock prices of $100 a ton, some assumed costs for grinding, we added even more if you grind it and for treating process, $50 per ton to actually do the treatment, and $7.50 a bushel corn, you probably make $40 to $50 if you get the same performance with 40% distillers. If you're feeding it with less distillers, as I showed here at the end, you will make less or maybe nothing more by treating the residue. But clearly, we've got to maintain carcass weights. If we don't, this is a break-even venture at best for people to be treating stocks, even in finishing diets. Okay, I want to talk briefly about lab work if you're treating residue, and then some on growing cattle. If you're going to test whether or not your treatment process is effective, many producers have tried it and they say, well, I don't know if it's working. The best thing to do is to take some samples when you're treating the residue before it's been treated, save those samples, treat your residue, and then after a week, send in the samples. Test it for dry matter. If you were targeting 50% water, 50% dry matter, that tells you that you got the water on appropriately or not. Test it for the amount of calcium. You should run about 3 to 3.2% calcium by adding 5% calcium oxide to the residue. If you have the original sample, you can look at what's the NDF of my original sample versus my treated residue. And you can also look at pH. It should be a pH of in the upper, lower, somewhere in a pH of 8 or so. The best way to evaluate is doing some fairly complex lab tests, in vitro digestibilities, and that kind of thing. Whenever you send a sample into the lab, they're going to send back a report that has a TDN, an NEM, NEG, some of these energy values, and those are essentially meaningless for this treated residue because they just weren't developed. Those equations weren't developed for that purpose. They're pretty good for many forages. They're not good for treated residue or for residue in general. Just to illustrate what happens to NDF in our studies that we've had, just a few of them as examples. We had residue that went from in the 80s to the 60s to 70s, so somewhere around 11 to 19 percentage unit decreases in NDF measured when we treated the residue. So you do solubilize some of the NDF, and the NDF that's left is more digestible. And then before I get to the two growing studies, we looked at calculated TDNs from performance across some of those experiments that I've been presenting. And you can see that the TDNs that we're calculating for the treated stover vary from in the low 60s to the upper 70s. This low 60 is not going to work. If that's a consistent response we get, that's not going to be economical. This TDN in the upper 70s would be very economical. I point out that if you just do the math and you take 20% treated stalks and you replace 15% corn and 5% stalks, and you get equal performance, then the TDN had to be 78.25 to get equal performance. Okay, maybe the most new concepts that we've tested with this calcium oxide treated forages is with growing cattle. This is an experiment, again, that's new and will be coming out in our new beef report, where we looked at feeding treated corn stalks. There were some other treatments in this study that I can't discuss yet, but these were some of the treatments for 80-day growing cattle, and you can see that the cattle significantly ate more residue when they were fed treated stalks compared to untreated, and they gained more. Now, the diets that these cattle were fed was 60% stalks, treated or not, 36% wet distillers grains, and 4% supplement. Now, notice, though, that it's only a 1% improvement in feed conversion. So for growing cattle, when you treat the stalks, because gut fill limits intake, they are able to eat more and gain more, but they're not necessarily that much more efficient. And this is a study, a similar design, 69-day growing study, where we had large numbers of steers with 7 pens per treatment, with diets having in the upper 60s for percent residue, 30% distillers, and then either 1 or 3% supplement. And the reason for that difference is that it was 3% supplement in the 2 untreated diets, because that had limestone in it, and it was 1% supplement in the 2 treated diets because they didn't need the limestone because we were adding calcium oxide to the treated residue. So we did this with stalks or with straw. And I just want to point out that in general, cattle ate more when they were fed the treated residue as compared to the 2 untreated residue diets. They gained more than the untreated, but efficiency, again, it was significantly better, but it was not dramatically improved when fed in growing diets. Nothing like what we've seen in the finishing studies. So I know my time's about up. I guess some general conclusions to kind of wrap up what we think we know about the feedlot side is that we need to work on ways to make sure we get similar feed conversion when we look at 20% treated stalks compared to 5% controlled diets. In 4 of the 6 trials we've done, we did. The 2 that I've presented today where we did not get identical performance, statistically anyway, were 2 yearling studies. I don't know if that's important or not. The treatment cost of doing this in the feedlot system is very important to whether it's economical. It's very challenging for producers to manage the actual treatment process, and so companies like Performance Plus and ADM and others are working on ways to help producers with that and to be able to pull that off commercially. The big question on whether this is important to do or not is really dependent upon what the corn price is and what the costs of our residues are, whether that's stalks or straw. And really it's the relationship of those 2 costs. So even though residue prices have been fairly high, corn prices have been even more greater, and so it's been economical. If we have cheap grain and for some reason residue's not in the future, then this doesn't make as much sense. Be sure we look at things on a carcass basis when it comes to feedlot cattle, because we don't need to be selling fill at the end of the feeding period. And from this last study that we just completed, we know now that it's critical that if you're going to have treated residue, you've got to have that in combination with a fairly large amount of distillers grains in the diet. In all the studies where it's worked well, it's been 35 or 40% wet or modified distillers. In the one study with less distillers, it did not work as well. The 2 growing studies we have to date, they were very consistent. We saw fairly large increases in intake because of gut fill and greater digestibility. Their cattle were able to eat more. That led to an increase in gain, but not near as dramatic of an improvement in feed conversion. We believe that the TDN increases that we're seeing in these growing diets takes residue from the mid-40s TDN to the mid-50s. So I just put an example here. We would assign a TDN to corn stalks of about 43, and we think it might get it to 53, maybe 55 in a best case scenario. Therefore, it's not as economical to treat residue in these growing diets, at least in the 2 diets, the 2 studies that we've conducted, which has more than 60% residue in the base growing diet. So is that completely bleak for growing cattle, or maybe even on the forage or on the cow side? No, there might be some other options that are economical. Ammoniation is one that we think is more feasible, but it's difficult as well. But the benefit in ammoniation, frankly, is you don't have to grind because you're treating it with a gas, and the ammonia helps provide protein needed, and you can feed the bales without grinding. If you have access to wet byproducts, which I understand not everybody does, but if you do, the wet byproducts provide the protein that the cattle would need anyway, and you might just be able to feed a little bit more byproduct relative to stalks if you want to increase gain. And clearly, mixing fairly unpalatable residue with wet distillers grains or modified distillers grains or even other wet byproducts dramatically improves palatability and consumption alone. But treating will also improve consumption as we've observed. And then lastly, and we're exploring this more right now, and we'll have some future talks on this, but you might consider silage, because that might be one of the cheapest sources of TDN for growing cattle. Aaron, I've been watching the chat history and don't have any questions, so either everybody's fallen asleep or they're not thinking through questions yet. But I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
So we'd open it up to questions. I see one coming in.
Change their mind.
All right. Well, I would remind you that the presentation today will be archived at the beef.unl.edu website. It's under the webinar section there. And coming up on July the 2nd, we will be having a webinar. Dr. Galen Erickson will be with us again, talking about de-oiled distillers grains and the feed value of those in both growing and finishing diets. Very good. I think that's it, Galen.
Okay. Thanks, everybody, for being on.